Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Evan Malbrough, and this panel is called Two Bills to Change the Future with Representative John Sarbanes, as well as with Nancy Abudu. Thank you guys for being with us today. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Doing well, thank you.
So to give the audience a little look about who you guys are, because both of you guys are phenomenal individuals and advocates, I would love to get just a quick bio and introduction from you.
Well, let me start real quick. I've been in the House of Representatives in Congress since 2007, I guess. So in my 8th term, I represent Maryland's 3rd district. I've been very focused on issues involving healthcare, consumer protection, prescription drug pricing, volunteerism, the Chesapeake Bay, and environmental issues. But certainly a lot of my attention over the last few years, and most intensely right now, is on democracy reform and making sure we're doing what's right to lift up the voices of everyday Americans out there at what is a very, very critical moment in the life of our country and our democracy. So very glad to be with you today. Appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you, Evan, very much to you and the foundation for having me. I am an attorney. I currently work with the Southern Poverty Law Center, leading up the organization's voting rights practice group. Prior to that, I was the legal director for the ACLU of Florida, where my docket expanded to include issues around reproductive rights, immigrants' rights, free speech issues, as well as looking really at issues surrounding school to prison pipeline education. Although when I was in law school, I actually concentrated in environmental justice, and at one point thought I was going to be an environmental lawyer. So I'm very happy to be with you all to focus back on my area of specialty, which is voting rights, and for sure ensuring that we have federal legislation to protect the rights of those, especially living in the Deep South.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys both for your service and your expertise. I'm sure many young people, as well as myself, really appreciate the work and the groundwork you have laid for us. So let's just hop right in. So Representative Sarbanes, so you are the sponsor of the For the People Act. Could you share with us what really inspired you to drive this groundbreaking legislation forward?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. I'd like to correct people and say I'm not so much the sponsor, although technically I am, as I am the assembler of the For the People Act, because it really represents incredible work that's been done for years by members of Congress, but more so by Americans out there who kept telling members of Congress, we need to see change. We need to fix what's broken in our democracy. So I was given the opportunity to work with a team to try to pull together all of these wonderful pieces of legislation that had been introduced over many, many years, including, by the way, the Voter Empowerment Act, which is the first 300 pages of the For the People Act, and was written and introduced for 5 Congresses in a row by the late John Lewis. It was his attempt to raise the bar nationally on making it possible for people to access the franchise in this country through enhanced voter registration opportunities and, of course, actually getting to the ballot box. So that's very much at the center of what we are trying to achieve with this reform. I came to it in some ways through the lens of arriving in Washington, discovering how much influence, undue influence, money and special interests have on the way policy gets made in Washington. It's often insiders and PACs and donors that call the shots instead of the priorities of everyday Americans being the ones that set the table. And I wanted to respond to that, so I started looking at campaign finance reform. Then we began to work with a broad coalition that said, let's also pursue ethics reform and do what we need to do in terms of the ballot box. The result was putting together this overarching piece of legislation called the For the People Act, which is H.R. 1 in the House of Representatives and S1 in the United States Senate. And we're now in the home stretch of trying to get this over the finish line.
We absolutely hope it does. Thank you, Representative Sarbanes. Nancy, this question's for you. As someone who is on the front lines, who has pushed for greater enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in the courtroom and outside the courtroom. Why is this new legislation a necessity?
Well, it's absolutely critical. Number one, unfortunately, our country has a history of making it difficult, if not impossible, for historically marginalized communities to exercise their right to vote. We've seen that in terms of the liberation or that struggle of so many Black Americans, again, around the country, but especially in the Deep South. We see it with respect to our increased immigrant community and many of them being naturalized or born citizens who are also experiencing difficulty in exercising their right to vote. And then we also see it in terms of the difficulty of access, especially when it comes to young people, when it comes to those with disabilities or senior citizens, especially people who need extra assistance when it comes to being able to vote, understanding the voter registration process, and making sure that their vote actually counts. And so because we unfortunately have been seeing an onslaught of laws, I think one of our partners, the Brennan Center, has estimated that there are now over 350 state laws that have been enacted or proposed that would make it more difficult for people to exercise their right to vote. That means that there unfortunately is no option left for many of us other than federal response to these kinds of bills. And that is what the For the People Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act represent. They represent a response to these restrictive, suppressive laws. They represent a response to the Supreme Court's continuing effort to make it more difficult to achieve legal protections for the right to vote. And they also serve as inspiration and further encouragement for people to exercise their right to vote, because they know that the highest lawmakers in our land, Congress, is absolutely behind them and supportive of making sure their political voices are heard.
Wow, Nancy, thank you so much for such a wonderful answer. So, Nancy and Rep. Sarbanes, you guys both hit on something that intersect at one thing. Representative, you hit on history, right? And then Nancy, you hit on the history of suppressed groups. And then Representative, you also hit on the fact that the bill has already passed the House and it's going to the Senate currently. It's SB1. So I have a question for you, both of you. So right now, the current discourse in the United States is pretty much the right to protect the vote and expand the vote versus the maintaining of the filibuster. And I would definitely love to see what you guys' insights are on that. As we all well know, with the current filibuster in place, it will make it very hard to pass this legislation, not just on its merits, but on the current political climate we live in.
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I think you've laid it out very well. This is a choice, and in many respects, I think it's an existential choice for our democracy between whether you want to protect the filibuster, which is just a rule. It's not in the Constitution. It's not something that has to be imposed on themselves by the senators. Whether you want to protect the filibuster or whether you want to protect the democracy. I wish the stakes weren't that high in this instance, but I think they really are. And it's why we are trying to raise the temperature out there, add as many voices to the chorus that will say to those senators, in this moment, you have an opportunity to do great things to protect our democracy, to respect the voice of everyday Americans out there. Now, we know the path is tricky. We know that the senators on both sides like holding on to that filibuster, but we see increasing movement towards an effort to reform the filibuster in ways that could allow this to get over the finish line, which is absolutely critical. And Nancy for sure could detail, I'm sure, dozens of instances where we need the pre-clearance that is part of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But you also need the For the People Act, because pre-clearance can't cure things that have already happened. And to stop this voter suppression stampede across the country, you need to have the For the People Act as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Agreed, and definitely recognize, and again, another appreciation to you, Representative Sarbanes, for keeping up with that fight. What I'll add quickly is number one, in terms of the filibuster, unfortunately, it is just the latest issue, an example of structural procedural hurdles that have been erected to make it very difficult for progressive legislation to pass. And I think what we see again is the erosion when it comes to discussing voting rights from a right to a privilege, and the idea that people have to somehow go and overcome serious obstacles in order to prove that they themselves care enough about that right, rather than recognizing that our democracy simply cannot work effectively unless people are actively engaged. And part of that engagement is government encouragement of that. And so I would say also, in terms of Senator Manchin's op-ed, that unfortunately it examines and highlights the wrong statistics. When we talk about bipartisanship, I would encourage the senator and others to focus on the bipartisanship that we see at the state level. There are over about 43 states that have some form of early voting. That means in Republican states. There are about 34 states that have some form of no excuse absentee voting. Again, that means including in Republican states. So our challenge as the people is to translate that bipartisan support at the local state level to have it manifested in Congress, so that our Congress members can understand that that is what bipartisanship looks like. It looks like representing the bipartisanship that we're seeing again at the state level.
If I could, just for a moment, I want to emphasize something that Nancy just pointed out, because the other thing that Senator Manchin keeps saying is that the For the People Act is a partisan bill. But that's based on him looking at where Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans are. I mean, they stand against the bill, and then because none of them are for it, they accuse it or criticize it for being partisan. But my judge, and I think Senator Manchin's barometer of whether something is partisan or not, is how people out in the country feel about it, which is what Nancy was just pointing to. And the fact of the matter is that broad majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents support this bill, including in West Virginia, by the way, because there's nothing in this bill that's controversial. Protecting the right to vote, the freedom to vote, fixing partisan gerrymandering, making sure there's a culture of ethics in Washington on the part of lawmakers and executive officials, pushing back against this undue influence that big money and super PACs have. I mean, many of these things poll off the charts, and as I say, including in West Virginia. So judge whether something is partisan or not based on what the people of the country are saying. And in this instance, they're saying, we stand for this across the political spectrum. It's not controversial. The only controversy is that it's taken us this long to get to a point of putting these reforms forward and potentially getting them over the finish line. That's on us. Last November, the American people stepped forward, pulled the democracy back from the brink, thank God. But in doing so, I think they were saying to the representatives, now it's your turn. Go to Washington, make the change that can protect our elections as we move forward. So we have to stand up and do this, or shame on us as lawmakers.
That's a great point, Representative Sarbanes. Nancy, I have a very quick question for you as well. So you referenced how the Brennan Center has reported there are over 400 bills being proposed that could suppress the right to vote for millions of Americans. So in your estimation, how will the potential passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act help fight back against those laws?
Sure. Well, one, there may be by now 400 bills, but the latest estimate I saw was 350, and let's hope that we can keep the number low. The second thing I will say is that, sometimes for the SPLC, we've described the For the People Act as the medicine, that we have states that have erected very suppressive voting bills that need to be remedied. And that the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is like the vaccine. It makes sure that our democracy remains healthy, that we do not become victim to the big lie that we continue to hear now rolled in and manifesting itself in some of these regressive state as well as federal proposals. And so that's how we see these laws. As Representative Sarbanes said earlier, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was essentially eviscerated. That provision of the Voting Rights Act, some would argue, is one of the main reasons why we've seen an expansion of voting rights in so many communities of color and, again, other marginalized communities. The Voting Rights Advancement Act will restore that. It will make sure that a bill like Georgia, Senate Bill 202, or a bill like Florida, Senate Bill 90, never go into effect because of their regressive effect, and will allow us to really, again, gain some momentum in terms of encouraging and expanding access to the ballot box.
Nancy, I'm going to steal that metaphor. I love it. The vaccine. If we have a disease of voter suppression, the For the People Act can be the therapy, the medicine to help cure that. John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is the vaccine to stop it from happening in the future. Another metaphor I like is Senator Warnock says that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is building the fire station to put out the fires of voter suppression in the future. For the People Act is what we need to put out the fires that are raging now. But the combination effect of these things is to make sure the voice of every American is heard, because your voice is your vote.
Thank you both for your amazing insights and metaphors. So I want to move to the last part of this panel and focusing on the young people of the United States, right? You know, every day another young person turns 18, and every year somebody's going to vote for the very first time, right? So first of all, how will this legislation specifically impact students, right? So we have students voting maybe at home, mailing their ballots, voting on college campuses where they claim residence. How would these two pieces of legislation affect them?
Nancy, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, I think when we speak specifically about students, there are two key provisions. First is the no excuse vote by mail. For students who are a transient population, of course, being able to have the flexibility as to where and when you can cast your ballot becomes everything. And so that's one of the major exciting things about the For the People Act. I think the other thing is same-day voter registration. We know that a number of people show up on election day thinking that they still have an opportunity to have their voice heard, only to find out that they missed that 30 or 20-day window. And so if you have same-day voter registration, that cures that issue. And again, especially for students who find themselves moving and often might not know far enough in advance where their polling place or voting district, for example, might be. So I think those are some of the key provisions that specifically speak to students that are critically necessary.
Nancy's right on about that. And I mean, if you think about it, what we're trying to do in the voting space is make it so that when any American gets up in the morning on the day they've decided they're going to vote, whether it's sitting at their kitchen table filling out an oval on an absentee ballot, whether it's showing up at an early voting center, whether it's showing up on election day, that they have confidence that they can get that done on that day without having to have 4 or 5 contingency plans. And that's certainly the case for young people. And we know that young people in particular, when they dip their toe into the water of the democracy, when they reach for it, when they pursue their idealism about democracy, if they encounter obstacles that seem unfair, it really makes them feel cynical. And then you can lose them again at exactly the moment where when their voice is so incredibly important. The other thing is the money reforms in the For the People Act are designed to make it so that when public policy gets made, it's the voice of the people that controls, not the insiders. This includes setting up a new system for funding congressional campaigns, a voluntary system based on small donations and matching funds, which is very empowering to people. When you look at these systems across the country, we see them in states and localities because you feel like you have real ownership of the system. But what else does it do? It means that people who traditionally couldn't run because they don't have the means to fund a campaign, because they don't have their own money or know people with a lot of money, they can now step in. We've seen this again at the state and local level. And if you think about this broadly, what we're trying to do is make sure a diverse electorate can show up at the ballot box on election day. But we also want to make sure that when they look at the ballot, there's a diverse set of candidates that they can choose from. And that comes from changing how we do campaign finance in this country. So all those things are important because young people are the ones who, when somebody comes into office, there's a lot of hope attached to that. And then if it runs into this brick wall of special interests, it doesn't happen. It's very deflating and it contributes to their cynicism. So I think this bill broadly can help young people. Two things, last things I'll mention. University campuses would be established as automatic voter registration sites, very important. And there would be pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds so that when you turn 18, you're already on the rolls. You're ready to go and to be able to access your franchise.
Oh, thank you both for those insights. So we're coming up on the end of our interview. So following on this trend with young people, right? A lot of young people, as I said before, voted for the first time in 2020. Some even voted for the first time in 2021 with a double Senate runoff in my home state of Georgia. So what is your advice to young people to keep going, to avoid that cynicism, to make that their voices heard, and to make sure that their priorities are taken in consideration, especially to those young people who feel like they haven't been since they've started getting involved?
Well, so here we are talking about federal legislation, but my first piece of advice is start local. I think that's where we can really see the greatest change, seeing that a small number of voters can really make a difference. And then that provides the incentive and the momentum for people to remain involved and then to expand their involvement to the state and federal level. So that's number one. Number two is don't give up. Voting should be easier than it is. And that's, again, the reason why we have this federal legislation being proposed. But unfortunately, we're still in an environment where you have local and state officials who are trying to make it difficult. So our advice, again, at the Southern Poverty Law Center is don't give up and definitely contact us if you're having issues. And then the third piece is that we still, as Representative Sarbanes said, we've got to get this over the finish line. So we've got to put some pressure on our senators to make sure that they understand that we, the people, want and need this legislation, and they need to represent us by, again, making sure it gets passed. Thank you.
I would say to young people, know your power. That demographic, just that age demographic, is huge across the country. And if that gets activated in a permanent way, you're going to have candidates, members of Congress, knocking down your door to want to make their case to you because of the power of your vote. So organize, Nancy Pelosi always says, don't agonize, organize. I would say that to young people. The more organized you get, the more power you have. And like I said, the numbers are there for it to be a force that has to be reckoned with in American politics. And we've seen that recently. We saw it in this last election. The other thing I would say is carry your power past Election Day. In other words, yes, campaign, vote, volunteer, be active in elections, but keep going after Election Day when it comes to policy. And that's actually what we're talking about right now, because we have a piece of legislation, two of them, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that are hugely consequential for the future of our country right now. All that power, that energy, that drive that young people brought to be part of this effort to pull our democracy back from the brink in the November election. And then, by the way, thank you, Georgia, to go win 2 runoff elections in the same state on the same day, which is the state that John Lewis represented in the United States Congress for decades, the author of the first 300 pages of the For the People Act. So take all that drive, carry it forward, and make it part of this push to get this legislation over the finish line. I think the voices of young people can be the difference makers in this effort at this moment. So thank you for all of that.
Oh, well, thank both of you for such a wonderful panel. I feel like our audience is going to have a lot of tools to not only push democracy forward, but also push their communities forward. So Nancy Abudu and Representative John Sarbanes, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me. And you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.